Thanks, Kelly. Okay, so let me go to our opening slide here. As she said, I'm David Schnocke. I'm the Forest Manager for the North Carolina Department of Ag Research Stations Division, and Ron Myers from North Carolina Forest Service did help out with putting this presentation together. And just a little bit of background on this. What this basically is this is a combination of a bunch of different presentations that have been given to a variety of audiences, ranging from private landowners to practicing foresters to trainees in the Ranger Training Program with North Carolina Forest Service, and students, and a bunch of different groups. So it approaches this subject from a bunch of different angles, and I hope that there's a variety of you here listening, that each of you are able to take some information out of it, even though some of this may very well be review for some of you. But have a pretty heavy schedule here. It is not advancing. Okay. Today's agenda, it's pretty tight, a lot of information to cover, so I'm just going to kind of launch right into it. But we'll start off today with a discussion and introduction to the Piedmont region for those of you who might be practicing forester outside of this area. We'll then shift focus a little bit and talk about some of the land use history and forest succession that takes place on many Piedmont sites, and then discuss some silvicultural options for managing some of the upland hardwood forests that have resulted through a lot of the forest succession as determined by the land use history on a lot of our Piedmont sites. And I am really just going to be focusing on upland sites. We have some nice bottomland hardwood stuff in the area. We just don't have time in an hour and 15-minute presentation. So starting off, kind of getting into the introduction. You can see outlined in red on the right side of the screen is the Piedmont region, extending from southern New York down the east coast of the United States, down through the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, and then part of Alabama. Best way to describe this thing is probably an old and heavily eroded plateau that is sandwiched between the Appalachian Mountains to the west and the coastal plain to the east. Its topography is probably best described as rolling, with pretty broad convex ridges that are occasionally dissected with pretty narrow floodplains. If we want to talk about site conditions here in the Piedmont and some of the other, the climate and those types of things, I really am going to focus most of today's talk on the southern Appalachian Piedmont region. The map does include that kind of darker red area up here. That's the northern Appalachian Piedmont region. I have some information from that, but for the most part, we're going to be talking about, right down in here. So if, there we go. I'm working on my clearing the screen here. Starting off with soils, probably the easiest way to just describe the soils of the Piedmont region is, I think we're safe just kind of calling it red clay. Okay? That's a vast majority of the soil that we're working with in the area, those red clay type soils. They can be pretty acidic, although there are some sections of the Piedmont containing some pretty alkaline series like Iredell. More on that later. They're oftentimes considered to be less fertile than some of the other orders, due oftentimes to their deficiencies in nutrients like calcium and potassium. But, when you're talking about fertility, it does kind of depend on a number of factors, not limited to what you're trying to grow and some of the land use history of the site. We have a pretty long history of agricultural use on some of these sites, and that can certainly impact the soils we have to work with. But in general, we can actually grow trees pretty well on a lot of our Piedmont sites, in spite of the fact that our clay subsoils are oftentimes our topsoils due to some of that past agricultural use. Fertilization can certainly help with a number of species, and I'm sorry, I'm getting could somebody tell me, I just got a warning on my screen that says my connection has failed. Could somebody type something verifying that you're still hearing me?
You can just ignore that, David. Sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So that's kind of the rundown of the soils, but it's actually okay, sorry, that screen was blocking me from advancing here. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. So within the Piedmont, we actually have a bunch of different subsections, and each one of these things has kind of slightly different site characteristics, soil characteristics. Precipitation can vary a little bit around the area. So I'm including this. I don't want to get bogged down in it too much, but just to kind of give you an example, here's a cutout area. This black box over here on the right, it's expanded over here on the left. This is the area that is roughly between Chapel Hill, North Carolina and Greensboro, North Carolina, located in the Piedmont region. And as you can see, it's only about a 45-minute drive in my Subaru, but we're going to cross over 3 different subsections in that short drive, and each one of these has some subtle differences. So as an example, if we start off on the right in the Southern Triassic Uplands, this has a different geology than the other 2 sections. Okay, we're consisting mostly of shales, sandstones, mudstones, and siltstones. The elevations are lower. It's a little closer to the fall line, a little further east. Not as much local relief, so not as much elevation change on the landscape. And those rocks I mentioned are actually a little easier to erode than what we find in the other 2 regions. So that leads to our stream valleys being maybe a little bit more wider than in some of the other areas. Base flows in those streams are usually pretty low, and the soils tend to be pretty clayey with low permeability in that region. If we move just a little bit west into the Carolina Slate Belt, if we kind of look hard at this DEM right here, you can see this is a much more rugged landscape than what we have in the Southern Triassic Basin. This is where the Uwharrie Mountains are located, if any of you guys are familiar with that. Soils tend to be dominated by silty clay loams, with that hard clay or that red clay underneath them, dominated by series like Georgeville and the Herndon series, which are both very deep, well-drained soils with moderate permeability. We pick up some pretty xeric site conditions in this area. Just as an example, some of the sites I manage have a decent amount of chestnut oak growing on them. If we just move a little bit further west still, we're in the Charlotte Belt. And again, you can kind of look on this map and you can see that we have a little bit different topography in this area. It's a little bit more of an irregular plain. Geology is dominated by gneiss, schist, granite, topped by those red clay subsoils. Deep, but not as deep. Well-drained soils like Cecil, Appling, and Madison series are pretty common in this area. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation about, while a lot of the soils are acidic, we actually can pick up some alkaline stuff here. These types of areas, or this particular region, we can pick up things like the Iredell series, which are more alkaline soils. They formed over more of a diabase rock oftentimes. And these are oftentimes associated with some of those kind of blackjack oak prairies and woodlands that we read about in some of the historical accounts of the Piedmont. So again, these aren't major differences across the area, but they are subtle, and just our geography and our soils and those types of things can lead to slightly different species compositions, different competing species on these different sites. So the point I'm trying to make here is if you're a forester practicing in the Piedmont, please take a little bit of time. It's probably a good idea to take a look at where you're actually working and how some of these differences might influence your management options. So getting back to the Piedmont, other than soils. If we look at precipitation in the area, we range from about 45 to 55 inches of precipitation a year, most of that falling in the form of rain. We get a little bit of snow, but not that much. Precipitation tends to decrease as we move north. And one of the things that's actually pretty great about the precipitation that we get here is it's fairly evenly distributed throughout the year. Our summer months can be a little wetter, but it's fairly evenly distributed. Our temperatures range from about 58 degrees Fahrenheit to about 64 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's a pretty warm environment here. Nice and hot and sticky in the summertime, and our winters are quite pleasant. And that gives us about 205 to 235 growing days per year. So again, it's a good place to try to grow trees. We're part of the Southeastern Mixed Forest Province, and just as a snapshot of the forest conditions or the types of forests that we're frequently working with here, clip some forest inventory and analysis data for North Carolina from 2015. We're looking at about 49% of our forest categorized as oak hickory forest, about 28% of them being categorized as loblolly shortleaf. But I do want to point out that does not mean that 28% of our forests are loblolly or shortleaf pine plantations. A lot of this stuff is abandoned agricultural fields that are kind of working their way through succession here. And then about 14% of it is categorized as oak pine. And as is oftentimes the case in the Southeast, a vast majority of the ownership of forest land in the Piedmont region is private. There's a couple of couple of national forests like the URs in the area, but for the most part we're dealing with non-industrial and sometimes industrial private forest landowners, and that certainly impacts the type of management recommendations that we can do on the ground, types of management work we can do. So, a brief history of Piedmont forests. Probably one of the easiest ways to describe it would just say exploitive, but I'll get a little deeper than that. There's a number of historical accounts of Piedmont forests, and if we look right over in here, kind of old historical accounts describe these more open, fire-maintained, oak-dominated, pine on some site dominated forests kind of spreading across the Piedmont. There's obviously some variability out there, but it is fair to say that the historical accounts describe more open, hardwood-dominated forests than we're oftentimes dealing with today. When settlers started to move in the 1700s into this region, they very quickly converted a lot of those forests and grasslands that were out there and Native American agricultural fields very quickly began to use that landscape. A lot of it was converted to agricultural use and cropped, and the forests that were on areas that even back then they deemed as maybe being a little too poor to farm were still heavily harvested for fiber needs. Now, over time, though, a lot of the agricultural practices of that time weren't exactly focused on conservation, and there was some pretty heavy soil erosion in addition to a number of factors like wars and industrialization and things of that sort that ultimately led to a lot of these agricultural fields being abandoned. Now, as I mentioned on a previous slide, we get a decent amount of rain. The temperatures are nice here. We've got a lot of growing days, and our species that we work with grow pretty well on a lot of these sites. So it's not surprising that a lot of these abandoned agricultural fields very quickly reverted back to forest. Now, these forests have continued to be impacted by humans since then through a number of different factors. Many of them have been cleared again, turned back into agricultural land, and then abandoned again. I actually work with stuff that's been cleared 2 or 3 times at this point. A lot of it has continued to be harvested to different levels. Some has been harvested and converted over to loblolly pine plantations. Some gets burned occasionally. But one of the big human impacts that we still deal with here is fire suppression. It's not used on the landscape even close to the same degree it would have been during kind of pre-settlement times. And ultimately, that has led us to the types of forests that we have to work with today. And I just have a little picture here of, there's a loblolly plantation, and there's more of a hardwood-dominated stand. So how did we get there? One of the great things about this area is that there's actually been a ton of work on forest succession in the Piedmont. And if we take a look down here on the bottom of the screen, there's a bunch of papers that I would point you towards if you want to read for hours about forest succession in the Piedmont region. I'll try to walk us through it in just a few minutes here to kind of shed some light on how we got to a lot of the forests that we're managing right now. So following abandonment, we go through a period where we're dominated by different grasses, and then we start to move more into a grass shrub environment. But eventually, it doesn't take too terribly long, especially if there's a seed source nearby. But a number of heavy seeding, pretty fast-growing pioneer species became established on a lot of these old field sites. Examples of those would be things like loblolly, shortleaf, and Virginia pine, depending on where you are in the Piedmont. Shortleaf in Virginia being a bigger deal out west, loblolly being native and very aggressive out east. Hardwood species like yellow poplar, sweet gum, and sometimes red maple in the early stages, actually oftentimes red maple in the early stages, also become established during that time. Now, as these stands develop, they typically are dominated by those fast-growing pine species, and basically form these very dense forests on these old field sites. However, there are still hardwood species that either became established early on, like oaks, or get established a little later on, after 20 or so years, according to some of the papers, that either persist or continue to kind of bank up in the understory of these species and persist. As the pine in the overstory and some of the other hardwood species start to succumb to things like competition-induced mortality or disturbances from, ice, wind, hurricanes, those types of things that frequently hit the Piedmont, or hurricanes not frequently, but the normal disturbances that we experience mostly when here in the Piedmont, as they start to take pine out of the overstory, we see a gradual shift from the pine dominance to more of a pine hardwood mixture. And then over time, as we move through this, we start to see a lot of the hardwood species start to dominate the stands and move into more of a mixed hardwood climax forest cover type, which on many of our sites, particularly our upland sites in the Piedmont, is oftentimes dominated by oak and hickory species. So that leads us to kind of what we have today. And here's just a snapshot of a couple of different forests that we have depending on the types of site we're working on. So here's an example of one of those loblolly pine plantations. This was planted about 20 years ago on an open field, machine planted. That's why we have those nice straight rows. But if we look in the understory here, we're looking at a couple hundred hardwood stems per acre. Actually, probably more like a couple thousand, but a couple of hundred of these things are actually oak species coming up, and we didn't plant them. They're coming in through natural means, variety of animals and things of that sort. If we look over here on the right, this is a ridgetop site in Durham County. My technician's standing on it. This is about a 90-year-old stand. A lot of the shortleaf pine that was out there is on the ground now. But if we walk through that, it's corduroyed. We can see the old plow lines through the entire area, and it's now developed into kind of a more open canopy, oak hickory dominated forest with a decent amount of oak advanced reproduction coming up naturally in the understory there. If we look down here on the bottom side, this is a slightly higher quality site. We have a lot of yellow poplar that is in the overstory. There's still a decent amount of oak in there. And I know this is a winter photo, so it's kind of tough to see to see it during this time of the year, but this is such a low light environment. We really are not seeing much in the way of regeneration underneath this particular stand. And then we look over here on the right. This is pretty common for a lot of us, and this is kind of a picture of what we would describe as mesification. So this is a oak hickory dominated overstory. There's one of my white oak trees right there. And beneath that, though, we have a mid-story and understory layer that is just completely dominated by red maple. It's leading, ultimately, there's a number of studies out there that are kind of showing that this is changing the understory environment and ultimately kind of determining what type of other species can regenerate underneath that kind of thick layer that they have. So these are just some of the conditions that if you're working in this area, these are the types of forests that you're likely to run into, and these are the types of forests that I'm going to kind of throw some management options out there for during this presentation. So the approach that we often take around here and where this presentation comes from is really, I don't want to use the word predictable, but there's a lot of information on forest succession in this area, and these forests are oftentimes kind of moving through these stages as this model would suggest. So kind of the way we approach it is managing forests in the Piedmont region is oftentimes just managing through these successional patterns. A lot of us have forests that are in various different stages of these different stages of development, and there's various tools in our toolbox, silvicultural methods that we can, and treatments that we can do to kind of help steer these forests in certain directions to meet our landowners' objectives. But some of the notes that I kind of want to underline as we start to move forward this. Bear in mind that a lot of these stands oftentimes, especially our uplands, oftentimes transition from pine-dominated to pine hardwoods to more of a mixed hardwood. So the point I'm trying to make here is a lot of these oak hickory forests that we have in here did not develop underneath oak hickory forests. They oftentimes developed underneath more of a pine-dominated forest. Regeneration from seed oftentimes plays a bigger role in the earlier stages of succession than in the later. Where I'm getting at with that is a lot of this stuff came from seed, whereas in these kind of later stages, unless we have very large disturbances that open up kind of a lot of growing space, we usually see the regeneration in these kind of later stages dominated by vegetative reproductions like seedling sprouts and stump sprouts. And that kind of determines some of our regeneration harvesting that we would do if we're managing stuff a little later in the game. Also contributing to that would be factors like soil depth, topographic position, severity and frequency of the disturbances, or oftentimes what we're dealing with, lack thereof. And those are all going to kind of influence how these forests move through the successional process. All right, so before I start getting into some of the silvicultural methods, though, I'm going to kind of practice what we oftentimes preach here, which is conducting a thorough and honest site assessment, because this is a critical first step to hardwood management, not just in this region, but basically hardwood management in general. So what we're going to talk about a little bit is site quality. We'll talk a little bit about the condition, age, and size class and distribution of the overstory species, or trees by species. And we'll also talk about the condition and regeneration potential of the understory vegetation, because we have to have a handle on all three of these things if we're really going to be successful in making kind of informed decisions to better meet some of our landowners' goals and objectives. So starting off with site. Again, we're just kind of approaching doing, I'm trying to move something on my screen here. Okay, that's gone. Great. First part of the site assessment, taking a look at our site. The 2-minute version of this is a general takeaway. Microtopography in the Piedmont can definitely influence species composition and productivity. So here's a cutout, here's a clip of kind of our usual landform that we deal with here in the Piedmont. We have our kind of flat uplands, convex slope right here, concave as we get downslope, leading down to our floodplain. I am going to be focusing on this area up here for the most of this talk. I have lost my screen somehow. Oh, okay, I'm there. So that's pretty much what I'll be focusing on. And some of the general rules that we would have here is we tend to have an easier time managing oak, by which I mean we fight species that have a little higher requirements for light and productivity. We fight those species less on some of our upland sites. So when it comes to kind of trying to manage species like oak, these kind of upper slope positions, that tend to be a little bit more xeric, thinner soiled, especially on kind of south-facing slopes, tend to be where we have the easiest time managing those types of species. Whereas species like yellow poplar, red maple, sweet gum, those types of things, they're very difficult to get off. Basically, they're going to end up on some of these more music sites, and they grow very well on those sites. So if your goals and objectives include those species, if you have, decent amount of moisture and decently deep soils on some of these sites, they grow pretty well out there. Oaks do as well, but again, we're fighting some of those faster growing, or species that have faster initial growth on those sites. So kind of the general rules that we take away is these upper slope positions are where we have better luck with oak, whereas poplar tends to really do better on some of these lower slope positions and north-facing slopes. Whereas yellow poplar and red maple, they do a little bit better on the music sites. That said, they do just fine on a wide variety of sites throughout the Piedmont. So we're pretty much fighting those things no matter where we are. The next thing that we need to consider would be the condition, size, and distribution of some of those overstory trees. Now, I mentioned on a previous slide that when it comes to regenerating some of these hardwood species, it's oftentimes more heavily reliant on advanced reproduction and stump sprouting and and seedling sprouting than seed, especially kind of in some of those later stages. The thing is, though, is that those some of that advanced reproduction and seedling sprouts, that all ultimately comes from seed. So if we do not have it in our existing stand in the understory, and we want to try to get some of that stuff to regenerate, we have to actually have some of it in the overstory for us to be able to successfully implement intermediate stand treatments to maybe build some of that stuff. So we kind of have to take a look. We also have to look at whether or not we have any competing species that are also present in the overstory and likely to produce a lot of seed that could potentially cause us some problems. An example of that would be something like yellow poplar. that can produce a considerable amount of seed, and that seed can stay viable in the duff layer for 4 to 7 years, I think I've read. So it can be in there, and it can be pretty expansive, and as soon as we give it enough light, it oftentimes will respond aggressively and quickly fill in openings. Stump sprouting is another thing we need to consider. Again, that sprouting is critically important in a lot of these hardwood forests, whether or not we're talking about a natural disturbance or a planned disturbance like a timber harvest. So we have to kind of take a look at our diameter distribution over here and consider whether or not we have species that we would want to be stump sprouting in the area, and whether or not they are of a size that should give us any confidence that they're going to be successful long-term in that stand. An example of this is, there's plenty of studies out there that kind of show that stump sprouting really tends to decline with increasing diameter and age. So if I take a look at my lower diameter classes where I would expect the most stump sprouting, if I look at what I have, I actually do have a decent amount of white oak in there. That said, these are, if I had to guess in this stand, these are probably just the same age as these over here. They're just suppressed. So that might influence their sprouting ability. Whereas in my smaller diameter classes, which are going to be pretty aggressive sprouters, I have a lot of red maple. I believe that would be a yellow poplar coming up, so probably had some larger disturbance in the past. Other hardwood, that's probably going to be things like hornbeam. So in this particular stand, a lot of my stump sprouts are going to be of species that I don't necessarily want to have a lot out there. So that's just one consideration we might need to take here. The other angle is feasibility of the management options. A lot of these methods talk about coming in and maybe doing things like improvement cuts or thinnings. And the reality is a lot of the stands that we're working with here in the Piedmont are heavily degraded. They have been picked over through high-grade logging, and various other actions for a very long time. But we may not have enough volume in these stands to really do anything other than come in and do a total harvest and try to rely on what regenerates naturally out there. We have to take an honest look at that and really consider what we have to work with. And finally, we have to take a look at the quality and condition of the understory trees and their regeneration potential. So again, advanced reproduction really does play a major role in the regeneration of these forests. So we have to, through our forest inventories and data collection, determine whether or not we actually have enough advanced regeneration of the species that we desire, that we're trying to regenerate out here, to actually expect success. And if we don't have those, we have to kind of, again, take our overstory into consideration and determine, are there management actions that we can do to maybe get some seedlings on the ground? And then what can we possibly do to maybe build some of those seedlings into seedling sprouts in advanced regeneration size? So it's kind of a big circle here of we kind of have to take a look at what we have and really decide whether or not we can fix it, manage through it and get to where we want to be, or if it really is just time to start over again. The other thing to keep in mind when we do our assessments of what is growing in our understory is keeping in mind that not all species sprout equally. So even if we do have a decent amount of oak regeneration, for example, if that's what we're trying to manage for in a site, there's studies that come out of the Piedmont. There's been continuous forest inventory plots on places like Duke Forest that paint a pretty clear picture that species like yellow poplar, sweet gum, and red maple they do just fine sprouting around here, whereas oaks and hickories are oftentimes just okay. So we have to kind of take a look and make sure that we have the right proportions of what we're actually trying to regenerate. So now that we've done our site assessment and we kind of know what we have to work with in both our understory layers and overstory, and whether or not we have enough volume to do different types of sales, and what kind of site we have, and what putting the right tree on the right place and what is likely to grow well on some of these sites, it's always important to keep our landowners' objectives in mind. And a lot of us, I think we get pretty oak-centric on a lot of these sites, and believe me, I understand the appeal to that. There's a wide range of ecological and economic benefits to growing oak species. But if we really listen to a lot of our non-industrial private landowners' goals and objectives. I know from my time as a forester with the Virginia Department of Forestry, I met plenty of landowners whose goals and objectives would be very well met by a nice stand of gun barrel straight yellow poplar and some maple in there. And you know, we have to keep that in mind sometime. And also accept the fact that if oaks or species like that that are maybe a little bit more challenging to regenerate, particularly on higher quality sites, if those are what we're desiring in here, we're probably going to need to get a little bit more creative than we have been in trying to regenerate those species and influence some of the stand composition and structures necessary to regenerate those species, especially on the more challenging sites. We also have to keep in mind if those objectives are actually even realistic or responsible when some of these site conditions are considered. You hear it floated around a lot that, for example, hardwood management is less intensive than pine management, but as I think you'll see as I kind of go through some of the methods that are in this, is you know, trying to regenerate oak on a mesic site in the Piedmont is going to be every bit as intensive and expensive as some of the industrial pine management options that you might see on the coastal plain of eastern North Carolina. It is likely going to involve a lot of herbicide, multiple entries, and those types of activities. And we need to be able to communicate that to our landowners, make sure they really understand what's likely to be necessary on a lot of these sites. So I'm going to transition into some of the silvicultural options for managing hardwood-dominated stands at this point. And this presentation, just to kind of save time, I am going to focus on stand improvement treatments, by which I mean primarily tending, and regeneration harvesting methods on a lot of these sites. I have some slides on artificial regeneration. I cut them out. If you are interested in having those, my contact information is at the end of the presentation, and I'm more than happy to share them with you. But I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on that, actually any time on that in today's talk. So basically going to be kind of combining these two things and using those to kind of discuss some hardwood-focused silvicultural options that we might have here in the Piedmont. So I'm going to start off talking about tending. These are basically treatments that we would do to maintain the health of the forest and also increase some of the quality and the quantity of desired species. And whenever I'm giving like a definition of some of these practices, these are typically lifted directly out of the Smith Silviculture textbook or the Johnson Oak Ecology and Silviculture textbook. So that's where most of the stuff is coming from as far as definitions go. But the methods that I'm going to kind of be talking about and lumping into tending are going to be prescribed fire, as we use it to kind of control mid-story. Mid-story control using things like herbicides, and then talk a little bit about intermediate cuttings that might be an option in some of our sites. So prescribed fire, the whole picture says 1,000 words thing. Now, I'll be honest, this is not a before and after, but this particular site up here is just down the street from this particular site right here. Species composition-wise, landscape position-wise, they're very, very similar, and they're about the same age. I just didn't go in and get a pre-burn picture down here. But as we can see, this was an early spring fire, pretty aggressively run through this stand, and you can just kind of take a look at this picture and kind of understand we dramatically reduced, or temporarily reduced, the mid-story layer in this burn stand through doing one of these prescribed fires. And again, this is just kind of one of those initial burns that went through. So this is one of those tools that it can very quickly, and it's pretty affordable, alter some of these site conditions or some of the stand conditions temporarily or maybe even long-term, depending on your burning schedule on some of these sites. But it's a tool that we have available to us. Unfortunately, if you remember back on some of the pictures I showed of the Piedmont, in fact, I'll just jump back there. Yeah, we go to this. You can take a look. We have no shortage of trees in the Piedmont, but we also have no shortage of people. So we have Atlanta, Athens, Greenville, I think Spartanburg is somewhere in here, Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Greensboro, the Triad, and Richmond, Virginia, there's a lot of people, and we're not really showing any signs of slowing down the development in this area. So prescribed burning can actually be kind of a difficult thing for us to implement. There's areas where it's easier than others. I mean, Southside Virginia, for example. I mean, there's a lot of open areas out here, but it's not as simple as just going out and lighting it on. There's a lot of planning that has to go in, and it can stand in the way of us using this on a lot of sites. But there's been a considerable amount of research done on prescribed fire, and I'm just going to kind of limit it to this one slide. If I could point you towards one paper to just kind of get some information on how we might be able to use this to maybe help us regenerate certain types of species in some of our forests, I'd point you to this one by Brose, Day, Phillips, and Waldrop. They did a meta-analysis on 32 different prescribed fire studies conducted in mixed oak forests to kind of test whether or not fire could be used to kind of solve some of this oak regeneration problem, by which I mean this kind of moving in of more mesophytic species like red maple into the midstory, and that dominating that kind of sapling and seedling layer that is likely to respond and regenerate following an overstory disturbance. And what they pulled from the studies is that, yeah, fire can reduce midstory density, but that's mostly true amongst the smaller seedlings. Fire oftentimes doesn't do as much damage to some of those larger diameter midstory trees of the problematic species, even though things like yellow poplar and red maple don't hold up as well as species like oak when they're in those larger classes. They can still make it through a lot of those fires. Oak oftentimes sprouts at higher rates following top kill from fire than some of the mesophytic species, but that seems to be mostly true during growing season fire. Otherwise, if you're just doing dormant season fire, some of the studies actually show that the opposite is sometimes true. By doing those dormant season fires, we're actually kind of just regenerating more and more and more of some of those other species. Now, another thing that came out of some of these studies is that it shows that oftentimes when you use fire to kind of top kill your midstory layer, the height growth coming out from the rootstock of oak species oftentimes is about the same or comparable as some of the mesophytic sprouts. That said, they also point out in this paper, interpret that cautiously. Some of the way the analysis was done, it kind of pooled different hardwood species with different growth rates. So you might have a species with rapid growth, like yellow poplar, being coupled with a species with slower growth, like Florida maple or something like that, and that would kind of lead to some of that. So, but using fire can kind of help out with some of the sprouting and slow some of those other species down. Another thing that came from some of the studies is that by doing conducting prescribed fires, especially some that are hot enough to actually remove some of the duff layer, that can lead to improved and increased establishment of oak seedlings in some of those burned areas. And again, those seedlings are what we're ultimately probably going to want to try to build up into advanced regeneration size before we start messing around with the overstory on a lot of these sites. So fire can be one of those really good tools for us, but its effects really, they seem to depend on season and severity of the burn. Mid-story control. I don't have a ton of pictures of this, unfortunately, because this is not something that we do all that much of throughout a lot of the Piedmont. And I think that might be a mistake that we're making here. But here's a couple of pictures from more of the foothills range. I think this one on the right is actually out in the mountains, but I took what I could get as far as pictures from North Carolina. And these were taken by Ron Myers from some work that he did many, many years ago with North Carolina Forest Service. But when we're talking about mid-story control, in this presentation, I'm primarily talking about it done as injection or basal spray applications, or basically doing it with herbicides. And here's just two pictures. This is an injection job that was done in North Carolina, where effectively what we're trying to do, or what they're trying to do here, is use herbicides to eliminate mid-story species or undesirable mid-story species, to then open up more growing space and give a little bit more resources to desirable species. So pretty much in our application, we're talking about getting rid of red maple and sweet gum, and on certain sites yellow poplar, to give some of the oak seedlings, which are hopefully present on some of these sites, an opportunity to grow from seedlings into more advanced reproduction or advanced regeneration sizes. And this picture on the right here, this is several years after the practice, and as we can see, they came in and they took out the mid-story on this site, and we're seeing a nice red oak tree that developed quite well after having most of the competing vegetation around it removed through mid-story control. Now, unfortunately, there hasn't been a ton of research done on this in the Piedmont region. There's been a considerable amount of work done on this in other areas, though. This is a method that's very clearly outlined in some of the, I guess, Silva methods that you would see up in the Allegheny hardwoods. It's also something that's been discussed for the southern Appalachian Mountains. But again, here in the Piedmont, we're a little different area. We don't get as much rain as for example, the southern Appalachian Mountains do. Our topography is not quite as dynamic, and our species compositions can be a little bit different. But there's been a couple of studies. Cass and Boyette with North Carolina Forest Service back in 1998, they went in and did some of this, and they kind of followed the classic oak shelterwood method where they used herbicides to kind of thin from below and move thin from below to try to build up, or basically try to get some of the oak seedlings that were in this site to develop into advanced regeneration. And they did it with a chemical means. But what they did with this study is, I believe they only treated down to about 1 inch in diameter, the mid-story. So what they ultimately found after they came back in to kind of do the follow-up data collection is really all they did by doing this was release the red maple, sourwood, and black oak seedlings that were in that stand but were below the threshold for treatment. So it wasn't that successful. They did see a little bit of a response from the oak, but really they saw more of a response from the maple, sourwood, and black oak seedlings. Now there's another study that was done by Lotkin and Lowenstein in the Georgia Piedmont. Now this is more of a bottomland hardwood site, but again, it was in the Piedmont, and I'm taking what I can find. They came in and they did an underplanting, and they planted a variety of species: cherry bark, water oak, yellow poplar, and then did different levels of mid-story control to kind of see if they could use that to develop these underplanted seedlings into advanced reproduction size. And they were actually pretty successful doing that. I believe it was about 5 years is what it took them to grow them to the size where they're likely to be competitive following an overstory removal. But what they found is that they really had to do total competition control to be able to do that. The lower control methods just weren't really as successful. And then, again, that would kind of circle back to what Cass and Boyette found, is if you're not coming in and taking out basically everything else, it doesn't really seem to help out those other seedlings, or the seedlings you're trying to recruit. So if you want to do more, there's plenty of information. If you Google mid-story control with herbicides, you'll find plenty of information out there. But again, not something we do a lot of in the Piedmont. I actually called one of our herbicide contractors to kind of ask, hey, have you done much of this around here? And they said no, but also kind of followed up. Part of the reason is that this can be really expensive. If you take a look at some of our diameter distributions that we have in here, if you look at how many red maple seedlings you're going to have to spray to really kind of do a total competition control, you're talking about thousands of trees per acre that are going to need to be dealt with. So not a cheap practice, something we would probably need to be prepared for. Kind of move into improvement cuttings now, or stand improvement, or intermediate cuttings. And the three that I'm going to focus on are improvement cutting, by which basically we're trying to remove undesirable species to kind of alter the species composition and quality in our stands. Thinning, which again isn't oftentimes, like textbook-wise, is not necessarily focused on doing the same thing as an improvement cut. It's more of a density management practice. That said, as practiced most of the time in our hardwood stands, the times that this actually gets done, they're usually lumped together. When you're going in and doing your density management through your thinning, you take out species that you don't necessarily want out there. An example would be removing all your red maple, sweet gum, and loblolly from a stand first as you move it down towards B-level stocking. And then talk a little bit about crop tree release, which, as opposed to kind of a stand level treatment, is more of an individual tree focused treatment to reduce competition and kind of improve their health and productivity. So improvement cutting, I have to admit, I was hesitant to even include this information in the slide, but I wanted to include it just in case we do see maybe some changes in our local markets in a lot of the Piedmont, and this becomes more of an option. Unfortunately, if we were to start taking a look at hardwood pulp prices, which are common in the area, I think we all probably might understand that going in and harvesting small diameter hardwood trees might be a very tough sell, might not be operationally feasible on a lot of our sites. However, I'm just kind of throwing out hope here that if we were to see continued development in that market, or if new markets like things like pellets, as an example, continue to grow in the area, these thinnings and improvement cuttings really do seem to have some benefit to some of these hardwood stands. We do know that we can go in and do an improvement cut and very quickly alter some of the overstory species composition on some of these sites. And that can have kind of a domino effect. Again, we're talking about, we want to make sure that we have the correct species in the overstory, as they have a direct result on the species in the understory to help us with our regeneration goals. We also, there's plenty of papers right down here, point you towards, and these are all in the back of the presentation, show thinning can increase diameter growth in a lot of these hardwood species, similar to what we see in pine. That said, it takes a while. Most of the studies are pretty clear that it takes several years for these hardwood species to actually start kind of responding to these thinnings. It's not an immediate response. So, I mean, 5 years or more is what a lot of the papers are showing. Younger stands tend to respond better to thinning. That said, again, we run into that issue of the smaller the trees are, the younger the stand. As long as we're not talking about super suppressed trees, we're typically talking about a little bit younger, and they may not be merchantable yet. So again, these can be beneficial, but it might ultimately turn into a cost. If we can actually get the regenerate, or if we can actually get a thinning done, if we can do it, crown thinning, free thinning seems to be the best way to approach this, specifically trying to retain vigorous crop trees with clean boles and nice crowns. They have the best response from growth, and also if they're nice and vigorous and they don't have kind of epicormic branching on them already, these seem to have the fewer issues with epicormic branching. As is oftentimes the case, the heavier you thin, the more of a response and diameter growth you'll get. But if you open it up too much, a lot of these stands you'll ruin your quality by getting a lot of epicormic branching on them. Also, some species tend to respond better than others. This is an older study from, I guess, 1986, but you could see right here, the white oak, yeah, it responded, but not to the same degree as yellow poplar and red maple. Those responded quite a bit better. So not all species respond as rapidly as others. And as far as residual stockings go, I mean, it kind of depends on your objectives, but sorry, I had to take a drink there. Kind of depends on your objectives, but the majority of the papers that have been done on thinning in the Piedmont and other areas with regard to hardwoods, they really do kind of recommend staying between that A and B line. Dropping below the B line, you're opening up a lot more light. You're not taking advantage of growing space. Something else is going to take advantage of that. So kind of staying between that A and B line is really what's recommended. Now, crop tree release, last kind of stand tending treatment I'll talk about. Now, unlike thinning and improvement cutting, this is typically done a little earlier in the stand, ideally done a little earlier in the stand, and it's conducted to improve the health and productivity of individual trees. So this is not a stand-wide density management or species composition adjustment type practice. This is really, you're selecting individual trees and spending time trying to help them out. So what we would, this picture kind of gives the idea of what we're talking about. You go out, you pick, kind of a tree that has desirable form, or if it's a desirable species, and you pretty much come in, and this one looks like it was done through more of a mechanical means. You take out everything that is directly competing with it. Not everything. You don't take out all of the other species or all the other trees around it. You just take out the ones that are causing direct competition in hopes that you can reallocate those resources to that tree. So there's been some great work done on this. I would point you to this publication by Miller and others. It's in the back of the presentation. It's about a 20-page document that gives you a ridiculous amount of information on crop tree release. It's a great paper. Please read that if you're interested in this practice. But there has been some work done in the Piedmont. And general rules, kind of from some crop tree release studies that have been done in the Piedmont and other regions, is that trees with dominant and co-dominant crown classes really seem to be the best able to respond to this treatment. It is apparently not as successful if you do this trying to take suppressed trees and kind of move them out of their suppressed state. It just hasn't been as successful doing that. The earlier you can do this practice, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You should try to complete this practice relatively early in stand development, ideally kind of right on the onset of crown closure, to maximize the number of trees you have to work with. If you get in there too late, and that's kind of what this chart down here is meant to show, is, the earlier you are in the stand development, the more trees per acre you have to work with. As you age through just regular, natural thinning competition-induced mortality, you're going to see the number of trees per acre decline, and some of those trees are potential crop trees that without intervention are going to naturally fall out of that system. So trying to get in kind of during that onset of crown closure, which on a lot of our Piedmont sites is 15, 20 years of age, that seems to be the best way to try to get in here and do this. I corrected myself because there are studies out there, that and some others, that point out that if you come in and you do this too early, there have been examples of, for example, crop tree release in an 8-year-old stand. Yes, there's a diameter growth response, but that was associated with reduced height growth, which leads to more problems down the road. If you're going to do this, it's a good idea to just go ahead and release the number of trees, meet your crop tree target, work with what you have. Also bear in mind on a lot of these Piedmont sites, a 100% oak stand is not realistic. That is not naturally what develops out here, and you're probably not going to find that many trees to work with. So kind of the number that gets taken away, or kind of the number that is recommended in a lot of the studies that have come out of this, is shooting for about 60 to 70 trees per acre seems to be a realistic target, especially if you can go in there and do that early on. If you're doing this later in the game, like after 40 years or something like that, again, work with what you have. Release as many as you realistically can do. But don't be surprised if you only have a handful to work with. And even if you're able to release that 60 or 70 early on in the stage of stand development, don't be surprised when some of those that you released still succumb to mortality from different sources over the rotation of that stand. As far as local studies that have been done, this one by Matthews, this has been this is a master's thesis done out of Virginia Tech. And through doing crop tree release, I believe in about a 22-year-old stand, they were able to increase the diameter growth for southern red oak, northern red oak, white oak, and yellow poplar, and sweet gum on Virginia Piedmont sites. Through doing, I believe that was a 3-side release, so 1, 2, 3 in there. Sorry, 1, 2, 3 sided release. Another thing that came out of that study that's kind of interesting is that red maple didn't really respond. So that's interesting. I guess that's one thing that species didn't do as well in, because it really seems to do well in other areas, and it grows. So my kind of general takeaway for tending before I move into regeneration harvesting is that, kind of my case for tending here is that, again, the conditions at the time of disturbance, whether or not it's a natural disturbance or a planned disturbance like a harvest, are going to have a direct impact on the regeneration of these stands and what you have to work with 50 years from now. tending gives us the opportunity to kind of influence some of those stand conditions through both tree level practices like crop tree release earlier on in stand development, and stand level treatments like density management and improvement cutting to kind of alter light levels and species compositions a little later on in the game. So good tending really is therefore, it's a critical first step that we should really be making before we're conducting our regeneration harvests. A quote that I've heard from people, some variation of it at least, and I don't really know who originally said it, or else I would give them credit, was if you're standing in a stand getting ready to do your regeneration, your final harvest, and you're thinking about regeneration, you're about 30 years too late. And that's about right. And unfortunately, oftentimes our hardwood management here in the Piedmont region, we're approaching it from that way without spending the time doing the tending to get ready for the regeneration harvest or build the seedlings and establish the seedlings and saplings. All right, so we're on kind of the last stretch of the presentation. I'm going to switch focus and talk about regeneration harvesting methods in the Piedmont, and I have more pictures in this section. So now I am going to take the approach of trying to talk a little bit more about trying to regenerate oaks on some of our Piedmont sites as opposed to trying to regenerate things like red maple and yellow poplar. And part of the reason for doing that is, again, you can look at various studies, you can drive down the road, and I'm sure a lot of you who are practicing foresters in here probably have a good understanding that our current harvesting systems, clear cutting and for better or worse, some of the high grading or diameter limit kind of that's done around here, is pretty successful at regenerating mixtures of red maple, loblolly pine, sweet gum, yellow poplar, but it usually is just regenerating a little bit of oak. Kind of depends on your site, but for the most part, we don't really struggle to regenerate maple, pine, gum, and poplar. They're here and they don't show any signs of going away, nor should they, really. But as general rules here, the more overstory we take off, like this being a clear cut, basal area retention of 0, the more we improve conditions for shade intolerant species, maple, sweet gum, yellow poplar, pines. As we increase overstory retention, we start to shift the conditions and improve conditions for shade-tolerant species. Again, red maple is pretty shade-tolerant. That's super generalist, I think is what the Abrams paper calls it. But it can kind of go throughout here. But we start to see conditions decline for some of these faster-growing species. We don't regenerate a lot of pine underneath 45 square feet of hardwood, as an example. That said, depending on what you have in place at the time of harvest and the type of site condition you're working with, again, drier sites, we have a little more opportunity. We still do see some intermediate shade-tolerant species like oak regenerate on a lot of these sites. So our region, we tend to be a little drier than our neighbors to the east and the west. So while we do have our oak regeneration problem, we're oftentimes dealing with poorer sites a lot of the time. So we still do see some of the oak come back. But again, I'm going to take that approach on oak, so here's just kind of a different way to do it. Now, I lifted this graphic from the Johnson textbook, and I guess they got it from Hodges and Gardner down here. But I've added some information on it to kind of shift it over to a little bit more of a Piedmont focus. And the way to approach this is, it's the concept of kind of an oak regeneration window that we have to work in. So if we have more, we have our moisture gradient down here and our light gradient here. So mesic, decreasing in moisture to xeric, closed canopy, decreasing in cover to more of an open canopy. So if we are dealing with a pretty mesic site condition, maybe a lower slope position or a north-facing slope position, as we increase in canopy cover, we are really creating conditions that are more conducive to regenerating more shade-tolerant or sometimes some intermediate-tolerant species like red maple, Florida maple, American beech, dogwood, hickory, elm, ash, holly, hornbeam. Those are the ones that we're working with on a lot of these sites. However, as we increase as we decrease canopy cover, if we open it up a whole lot, again, on these productive sites, we're going to create conditions that are conducive to regenerating species that really like nice moist sites and productive sites like yellow poplar, sweet gum, loblolly, and the pine species that really thrive in kind of those highlight environments. But it's this area in between where oaks seem to be able to compete with some of these other species and actually still continue to play some role in those forests. But again, in these mesic sites, you can see our window isn't very open. There's not a lot of area to work in right here. So as we move across the moisture gradient, though, and we get into more xeric site conditions, this window opens up considerably. So as we get into more xeric site conditions, we are, oftentimes losing some of the productivity that some of these other species down in here would want. Kind of the same thing happening up here as we move in that gradient. Oh, sorry. We're starting to see the conditions change and be less favorable for some of these species, whereas oak, which is oftentimes considered to be a little bit more drought tolerant, a little more tolerant to some of those deficiencies in the site that some of these other species are less likely to deal with, our window opens up considerably as we move into more xeric site conditions and as we increase in canopy openness. So please keep this thing in mind as we start going through some of the regeneration harvest methods. All right, so the first one I'll talk about are the clear cut and the seed tree harvest methods. And I have included those as pretty much on the same slide here, primarily because they effectively do about the same thing as currently practiced in the Piedmont region. Clear cut obviously being a total overstory removal, seed tree being pretty close to the same thing, but retaining 10 or fewer trees per acre usually. So this would be an example of a Piedmont clear cut. This is more of a seed tree retention level as practiced. It's usually done at the stand level. This is by far the most common regeneration practice or method in the Piedmont region, particularly on private land. And oftentimes it's done just kind of right up to the property line, especially when you're talking about some of these fragmented, just kind of not too far outside of the urban center landscapes where, your average tract size is 45 acres or something like that. Oftentimes what you'll see is the whole stand kind of taken off all at once. That said, sometimes you see it done kind of at different levels: patch clear cutting, strip clear cutting. Patch seed tree, or strip seed tree. There's different variations of this as practiced, but again, very common in the Piedmont. Putting that much light onto the ground, kind of all at once like that, this method typically favors more shade intolerant species. A lot of it coming from seed, a lot of it coming from advanced reproduction, and a lot of it coming from stump sprouts. But we typically see species like red maple, sweet gum being huge ones, and if there's a pine source nearby, if there's a loblolly pine tree within 300 feet, you're probably going to get some loblolly in there as well. But that's typically what we see regenerating these sites, and we see about the same thing underneath the seed tree method. The seed trees is retained, they're typically not dropping enough. For example, if you're trying to retain oak seed trees, on most sites, it's not been shown to be successful in dropping enough acorns to really regenerate into that sea of yellow poplar. That said, there's some benefit to leaving some of those trees for snags, or because a lot of them ultimately die out, or structural complexity of some sort, den trees, those types of things. That said, we do have some success regenerating oak through the clear-cut method, particularly on some of our drier sites in the Piedmont, especially if we have done some kind of initial stand treatments or just gotten really lucky and have a decent amount of oak reproduction in place at the time of disturbance. So there are sites where this has worked. I manage some 20-year-old stands that have a decent amount of oak that has come back in them following just a simple cut. So it can happen, and it's up to you as a forest manager to, again, do that site assessment and see if this is going to work. So here's just kind of a walkthrough, and these were provided by Ron Myers of, we see our stump right here. This is a clear cut going through development. So this was a typical kind of clear cut. You can see a lot of volume left on the ground out here, but it just kind of depends on who you're working with, or the the timber buyer that you've worked with, how much of this material gets utilized. But clear cut harvest, they take almost everything down. There's a few whips left standing, but for the most part, pretty clean cut. It doesn't take long for stuff to start stump sprouting and seed in. And just a couple of years later, you know, you see our yellow poplar right here. But we have that kind of seedy yellow poplar and shade-intolerant species that quickly come back. But take a look. That's an oak coming up from a stump sprout. Here it is. And he's doing just fine. And we do see that on certain sites, especially our drier sites. We oftentimes kind of see oak able to compete in some of these sites, especially if it's, you know, present in that advanced reproduction size, or if we had smaller diameter trees that were still vigorous enough to stump sprout following overstory removal. But in general, not all that successful on the higher quality sites. Now here's one option, not specifically designed as an oak regeneration harvest method, but this is kind of an interesting method that variations of this have been done. Again, I manage a number of stands that have kind of been through this. This kind of fell and burn technique that was developed by a number of individuals down at Clemson. Clemson being the provider of a lot of the methods that are presented in this presentation. They've done a lot of work in the Piedmont. But the this fell and burn technique, it's pretty interesting. Consists of, you know, coming in and doing kind of your normal commercial clear cut on these stands, allowing it to sprout back, going back in and felling your residuals if necessary. Again, if we go back to this, you know, there's stuff standing out there still, oftentimes after a commercial clear cut. So you fell your residuals, preferably when the leaves are on, so it adds a little bit more fuel to the system. And then you run a hot fire through. And just as we talked about on the prescribed burning, if you can burn these things, particularly at kind of the seedling size, fire can really do a lot of damage to some of these mesophytic species. Not as much damage sometimes to some of the oak sprouts that come back, and it can, you know, in some cases kind of equalize some of the height growth from some of the sprout regeneration following top kill from the fire. So the way this method works is you basically run that hot fire through, assume that that's going to take out some of those mesophytic species, and then just straight plant pine and manage it forward as that, in hopes that you could potentially increase the proportion of oak that is in that pine hardwood mixture that will develop. Again, we manage a number of stands that are done like this. The brown and burn, for example, is a very common site preparation method that we use here. We cut it, let it sprout, spray it, burn it, plant pine. Well, we just leave the chemical out. A lot of times we'll cut it, burn it hot, plant pine, and let it ride. And again, we have decent luck with that. The shelterwood method, I'm going to spend some time on this one. The description of this method, and some of you probably immediately took a look at this picture and said, well, that doesn't look more like a shelterwood, or it doesn't look that much like a shelterwood. And you're right. This doesn't look like the traditional shelterwood retention levels that we typically associate with southern pine management, which is very commonly practiced in this part of the country. It's a much higher level, and there's a reason for that. So the description of the method here is a shelterwood is basically over and mid-story reduction in order to develop tree reproduction of a desired species beneath the parent stand. And the purposes of the retention, as practiced to try to regenerate oak, is really to kind of provide shade and shelter for a new age class to develop in the understory. There's also some aesthetics and structural complexity. It benefits wildlife considerations. A lot of people find this to be a lot better looking than a clear cut. But what we're really trying to do practicing this is not so much establish new seedlings, but give already established seedlings the opportunity and resources they need, while not giving their competitors the resources they need to develop into advanced reproduction size in preparation for an overstory removal. So again, we're not doing this to establish new seedlings. We're doing this to help out existing seedlings. And that's really when it should be implemented. At least that's what the studies are showing. So that's kind of the approach here. And I mentioned you don't want to open up too much for your competitors. So that's part of the reason we're looking at much higher residual overstory retention than is practiced in like a loblolly pine stand. So the shelterwood method is practiced in eastern forests, typically involves a couple of stages. Now, The first stage, often described as the first cut, it's oftentimes not a cut. As practiced in an oak stand, what we're really talking about is thinning from below, which again, when you look at hardwood pulp prices in some of the markets that we have, oftentimes the way to do that is through a chemical means. So not necessarily done with mechanized equipment. Now, if you can get it done, great. But oftentimes this is done through a chemical means. Even if you do it mechanically, the method is greatly improved by also following up with some chemical control of undesirable stuff that's going to come up in there. So what we're trying to do is remove the mid-story that is going to be competing with the small diameter or seedling oaks that are in here, while not providing enough overstory for enough light coming in for things like yellow poplar and sweet gum to start moving into the site and take advantage of it. So we're cutting from below. That said, this particular example, I might want to pick out, like, that's a big yellow poplar right there. Depending on how big of an area that's going to open up in the canopy, I might want to pick him out of there. Some of these other species in the overstory class, or these larger diameter classes, as long as I'm not producing way too much open area, as long as I'm not opening up the canopy too much, I might also consider picking those out. Better yet, hopefully I will have come into this stand 20 years ago and done some type of improvement cut to maybe increase the proportion of these larger diameter classes that are in oak and not in species that are going to continue to cause me problems by producing a bunch of seed. Anyway, as far as density reduction, there's no real number that I have found for the Piedmont. And I think it just, really, it kind of depends on site. 30 to 40% basal area reductions is what's been recommended for productive sites, having site indices of about 70 to 90 square feet, or 70 to 90 site index base H50 for red oak in the southern Appalachian Mountains. So that seems to be kind of the range that's not opening up too much space, but is giving enough light for the oak seedlings to develop. There's a study that's come out of the Piedmont, the fell and burn method, or not the fell and burn, the shelterwood and burn method. They recommend about 40 to 60% basal area reduction for intermediate sites in the Piedmont. It's still pretty productive, but compared to the mountains, they're more intermediate, which would be about a 70 to 80 site index. Now, remember that oak regeneration window that we had. In fact, I'll go back to it. So we talk about, there's not a big window on some of the productive sites. We seem to have a lot of room to work with if we're dealing with some more xeric sites in the Piedmont region as far as the basal area levels that we can retain. Okay. So, we could base it on the site conditions. Once we kind of have the regeneration in place, again, we only do this mid-story reduction when we actually have seedlings of the desired species present. Once they have developed, hopefully they've developed over a couple of years, we can then come in and take off the overstory of these stands. It's oftentimes known as kind of a complete clear cut, a patch clear cut, group clear cut. Oftentimes there's some overstory retention, irregular shelter woods or shelter woods with reserves as well. So it just kind of depends on your objectives, how you ultimately want to release those seedlings. But they will need to be released. They will need to be released from overstory competition, or they're likely to just kind of turn into seedling sprouts again and start dying off and coming back, or top killing and coming back. So here's just kind of some examples of our efforts at trying some of this in various parts of the Piedmont. Actually, not various parts. These are both from Durham County. But here's one application, and this is a pretty dry site. We're talking about site indices for white oak in the low 60s on this particular site. Decent amount of oak advanced reproduction in place at the time of harvest. A lot of small diameter oaks that were not suppressed and sprouted vigorously. So this is dropped down to about 30 square feet of basal area. Here's the overstory. Here's about how much light we're putting on the ground here. And it worked out to about an 80% basal area reduction, so pretty substantial. The results of this thing, unfortunately, we're looking at a bunch of red maple that came back. a bunch of yellow poplar, and a lot of yellow pine. That said, there's a decent amount of oak in this stand. I think it's a little too early to call it a loss, but there is a lot of yellow poplar and maple that came in. So, you know, again, on this particular site, maybe we opened it up a little bit too aggressively. We'll see. We're gathering data in there, but that's kind of an example of a very open version. Here is a little higher basal area. This is about 45 square feet per acre retained, and that worked out to about a 60% basal area reduction on this particular area. This is actually the same site. It's just on top of the ridge and a little further away from where the other picture was taken. And this is looking north. This is looking at the same site from the west. This area right here is so full of briars that if I tried to take a picture, you'd see a briar and a yellow poplar leaf, pretty much. What we've seen in here is underwhelming response from the oak seedlings. We're not really seeing a lot of the oak seedlings in this area start to build up into advanced reproduction size after 5 years. There's a little bit. We're in the process of trying to measure it and move forward, but we're not really seeing much now. We are seeing a good response from a lot of the oak stump sprouts in there, but more importantly, we're not seeing that sea of yellow poplar. We're not seeing that sea of red maple. We're not seeing a lot of loblolly pine coming in. These pine trees that you see right here, those aren't loblollies moving in. Those are underplanted shortleaf pine. So it's a different thing. Don't worry about those. But again, leaving a little bit more overstory really did quite a bit as far as knocking back some of those species that we didn't want in there. Now, another method of this, acknowledging that it's not as attractive to come in and do multi-entry or invest heavily in herbicides for a lot of private landowners. The shelter-wounded burn method looks like kind of a simpler approach that has been successful on certain Piedmont sites. So the way this one works is you come in and you do your basal area reduction. They recommend about 40 to 60% basal area reduction on some of these more productive upland sites. Waiting 3 to 5 years, you're probably going to end up with a sea of yellow poplar and other shade-tolerant species that come up, in addition to hopefully some of the oak that you had in there. You then run a prescribed fire through the understory, again, relying on the ability for oak to resprout following those fires and those other species not handling it as well, and hopefully increase the proportion of oak in your regeneration pool. You're then left with the choice of taking the overstory off or you know, leaving it on there and managing a 2H stand, or just mainly, or just burning it repeatedly and kind of managing as a woodland. And we've done some of this stuff down here. I can tell you the repeated fire does a number on the sweet gum, which is what we're fighting on that site. To save time, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but based on the studies that have come out of this, it has been pretty successful at regenerating oak on some of these productive Piedmont sites, particularly so when you're using a high-intensity spring fire or a low to medium-intensity summer fire. Again, that all circles back to some of that research that was done on the ability of fire to kind of help with the oak regeneration problem. But a couple things I will point out is stump sprouts tended to be taller than seedling sprouts, regardless of the treatment. So the stump sprouts really came back. Fire didn't do as much on that. And it had a larger impact on red maple and yellow poplar seedlings, again, than their stump sprouts. And they kind of lay this out in the paper that chemical could help. So again, the appeal to a method like this is its simplicity and the fact that it's reduced entries. But think of how successful it could be if we coupled it with some intermediate stand treatments. I'm just, you know, to save time and maybe get to some questions, I'm going to jump over group selection and just kind of say, look, we don't do it that often in the Piedmont. It is done. Typically, we're talking about small groups that get opened up. 1 to 2 times tree height is kind of an average diameter. It's generally not all that successful at regenerating oak as practiced in the Piedmont. That said, certain instances exist where, for example, if you're opening up a group over existing advanced oak reproduction and you couple it with follow-up herbicide treatments to take out the competitors, it has worked on some sites. So I'm going to move on and kind of wrap it up here. The general takeaways I hope you've taken from this is our Piedmont forests are pretty resilient. We have, you know, a decent amount of rainfall. A lot of species want to grow here, and they do respond pretty well to a number of forest management activities. And that's especially true if you want to manage mixtures of sweet gum, poplar, red maple, and pine. A thorough and accurate site assessment and making sure you have realistic expectations and that you have communicated that to your landowner of, what really is kind of possible on some of these sites. Those are key first steps in hardwood management in the Piedmont. We have to be careful to not oversell what we can do with some of these complex forests that we're managing here with lots of different species. Regenerating oak is more complex. We know that if we're trying to do it. We've experienced it. And there's unfortunately no silver bullet solution to the problem. Fire does seem to help on a lot of these sites, but again, it can be a real challenge to do it on certain Piedmont sites, given some of the development pressure we have in the area, as well as there aren't that many people offering the service. But, it can help. So tending is probably going to end up having to be one of those kind of essential practices, or some of those tending practices will be essential if we want to be successful later on. And as is oftentimes the case, we'll probably improve our chance of success in influencing composition, structure, and growth if we combine a bunch of different methods and really kind of tailor them to the type of site that we're working with, be it a xeric or mesic site, and with different variations in soil and species competition and competitors. So with that, I went over my time. I do apologize, but I think we have some time for questions.
Well, David, thank you very much. And again, this is Kelly McCarter at North Carolina State University. Because many of our attendees do need to take the survey and possibly the quiz, I'm going to post that information now through the webinar and ask folks to please make sure you take advantage of that. And then David will